Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. The number of Americans who feel race relations are bad in America is at an all-time high. 69% of Americans say race relations are bad. That is 1 point higher than the previous all-time record of 68% back in 1992. Those numbers came out just after the LA riots following the Rodney King beating verdict. CBS News partnered with the New York Times asking Americans about race relations in light of the recent deadly officer-involved shooting deaths of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And it's been nearly 1 week since Micah Johnson opened fire in Dallas, ambushing police as they monitored a Black Lives Matter march through downtown Dallas. 11 officers were shot that day, 5 were killed. Over the past 7 years, negative views on race relations in America have slowly but steadily climbed. From 22% in 2009, when President Barack Obama took office, to 69% today. For the next 30 minutes, we're breaking down these numbers and focusing on the conversation about race relations in America. CBS News elections director Anthony Salvanto will dive into these numbers. Also with us, Harvard University professor and author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Khalil Muhammad, and founder of Swagger.nyc, Sean-Pierre Regis. And in Cleveland, CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues. Jeff is currently working on a book due out next year titled Black and Blue: Aggressive Policing, Racial Tension, and the Crisis in American Law Enforcement. All right, Anthony, let's start with you. Right now, 69% of Americans say race relations in the U.S. are bad. So are there any glimmers of optimism in the numbers?
There are some. But what's interesting, Elaine, is when you look inside those numbers, you see that whites and blacks now agree in almost equal numbers that race relations are bad. And historically, that is notable because we have often found in the polls that African Americans were more likely to say that things were bad, while white Americans were more likely to say that things were good. And now the numbers who say that things are bad has increased among white Americans, so those two numbers are really comparable.
So what kind of an impact have the recent tragedies had?
Quite a bit. And one way that you measure that is in the direction that people think things are going. Not just the state of things, which, as we said, things are bad, but they think that things are getting worse. And that can be troubling to a lot of folks because it's not just that state of play isn't so good, but that if things are getting worse, that is then harder to turn things around. Having said that, you asked a little bit about optimism. There is one thing in here, and that is that while more folks say that they think that the Black Lives Matter movement has some points to make, that they agree, at least in principle, with some of their points, they also feel that their local police are keeping them safe, and they express confidence in their local police. So as far as the start of a dialogue is concerned, you have you have the backing for the police, for their local police. You have some agreement with what Black Lives Matter is saying, and so together that may be the start of some constructive dialogue, at least in acknowledging each side.
So polls are always a snapshot in time. How does this particular moment compare to other moments in time that we've seen in history?
You know, as you noted in the intro, we are seeing now a high point in the number who say that things were bad. And that's a sharp decline from that optimism that you had right in early 2009 when we found the highest number. That decline is notable not just for the difference, but for the expectations gap, that people thought things were going to get better and they haven't. In many ways, the election of President Obama kind of signaled for a lot of folks in the polls, not just that race relations could get better, but that it symbolized an ideal, right? That what Americans sort of go for, which is that race doesn't matter. You can be anything you want. You can do anything you want. Race ought not matter. So the disappointment gap there is notable. But then you go back all the way to 92, where you had the Rodney King riots in LA. That was the previous, low point in all of this. And the other thing to remember about the polls, whenever you look at this, is that they often take these snapshots right after tragic events. And so you don't want to look only at snapshots then, because that's when people are reacting and feeling really bad. You want to look at that whole historic trend line, which kind of goes up and down depending on the way people are feeling at the time, not just after tragedies.
Sean Pierre, I couldn't help but notice, so you were nodding as Anthony was talking about that time period immediately after President Obama was elected. You know, people have thrown around that term post-racial society. Why is it that you were nodding your head, and what do you see in these numbers?
Well, I just remember how I felt as a black man, you know, electing President Obama in 2008. I mean, I just remember feeling like this is it. This is the moment where we don't need to have this conversation anymore. The most powerful man in the land, in the world, is a black man. If he can do it, anybody can do it. But that was such, it almost seemed now, at this point, like a facade, right? Like a mirage. When you see what's happening on the streets today, and what I've seen happening on the streets for the last 2 years, especially through my Facebook feed, it was slowly, you know, eating at that mirage that I had in my head that everybody now could be equal, and that post-racial word was so special for young people, right? I threw it out all the time. I don't see race. I don't believe in race. But as I grow older, I realize, oh my gosh, this isn't going anywhere. We may never get to a time where there is true equality for the black man or for the person of color. And that is now, at 31, a really scary and saddening thought for me.
Professor Muhammad, what is your take on these numbers? Did these numbers surprise you at all?
I think that they confirm what many of us are feeling in our households, in the difficult conversations that we're having at work, in our sites of leisure, which is that we've got a lot of work to do. And the significance of singular success, in this case embodied in what Sean has described in the election of the first African-American president, really shows the limits of doing the hard work of making sure that our institutions are on the same page as our hearts often are. People want to do the right thing in many instances, but our institutions have not caught up with that kind of aspiration. This president in particular, to Sean's sense of optimism, played to our best selves. He wanted to bind us together in a kind of, we can now move forward in ways that have been difficult prior to this moment in 2009, and that's reflected in these polls. But just as Rodney King's beating and the subsequent acquittal of those officers in that case showed the level of low in race relations that we've now essentially matched, here we are yet again with the criminal justice system at the heart of a conversation about the quality of democracy and the quality of freedom in this country. And that, to me, shows through very clearly in these numbers.
I want to turn to our Jeff Pegues, our CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent. Jeff, let me ask you about the climate law enforcement is facing right now. We've talked a little bit here about the racial kind of conversation and the context, but what is it that law enforcement has faced here? Have tensions between law enforcement officials and communities of color changed? Have they grown? Have they eased? Because President Obama has certainly tried to have conversations started about some of these racial issues.
Well, no doubt about it. These are very difficult times for law enforcement. The men and women in blue across this country feel, and I've talked to many of them directly, I've talked to their representatives, they feel like they are under scrutiny like never before. There was talk about the Ferguson effect, that this cell phone videos of police in action has prompted this outcry for change, and as a result, police officers across this country are feeling second-guessed, Monday morning quarterback. As the basis for my book, I went to Chicago, which is a city in many ways in turmoil now when it comes to how law enforcement is dealing with the black community and how that city is recovering after the shooting of Laquan McDonald. You remember that he was a 17-year-old who was shot 16 times, and since that time, the city of Chicago has gone through this turmoil as the police department attempts to reform, but the rank and file in that city, I've been told, is stepping back. All right, so they're not enforcing as they did at one time. So this idea of proactive policing, they are taking a step back. And I heard that from representatives of rank and file police officers, because again, the police in Chicago, and we're really seeing this across the country, they are taking a step back. They're not doing all that they used to do, in part because they feel they are not appreciated and their efforts are not appreciated. And so there is a crisis in this country when it comes to law enforcement and how law enforcement interacts with the black community. And what does that mean going forward for law enforcement? So there are some real serious questions here. And all of this is unfolding at the same time that we're seeing spikes in crime in cities across the country. So these are very troubling times for law enforcement as it tries to respond to the criticism, as it tries in many big cities to reform.
So, Jeff, given what you just said, what are the kinds of things that those rank and file officials would like to see changed or different? Is it that in the communities that they police, they don't necessarily have cooperation from residents there? What are the sorts of concerns that these officers have?
Well, we talk about what has happened in the last week, the tension that police are feeling, the tension the black community is feeling as a result of the shootings, not only in Dallas, of course, but Baton Rouge and in Minnesota. And so all of that is having an impact on law enforcement in this country. Again, feeling, is one police official told us, feeling like police have a target on their back right now. And so this is a point where, yes, law enforcement agencies are trying to reform, but part of the problem is, and as I alluded to, it's happening at a time when crime is rising, and so reform means changing tactics. So when you're in a city and you're trying to figure out, well, why is crime spiking? Well, it may be because tactics are changing. Police are not having the interaction that they've had in the past with people in the community, the type of interaction that prevents crime from popping up. In addition, and this is another big issue for law enforcement and lawmakers in this country, there just aren't enough police officers to go around. The reality is, with all of the attention that policing is getting these days, it is harder for these police departments across the country to find new recruits. So there are so many related issues to how law enforcement deals with the black community and the response from law enforcement that it really is affecting policing in this country on the ground level in these neighborhoods and in many of these inner city neighborhoods where effective policing tactics are needed the most.
All right, Jeff Pagay, stand by for us. Coming up, we're talking policing in modern America. What can and what's being done to help relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. That's coming up after the break. This is CBSN. The shooting death of Alton Sterling was one of the things that motivated a sniper in Dallas to attack officers. 5 officers were killed in that ambush Thursday. President Obama spoke Tuesday at a memorial service for the victims, calling on Americans to channel their anger and sadness into bringing change. And now a CBS News-New York Times poll says the number of Americans who feel race relations are bad in America is at an all-time high. I want to turn back to our panel here. And Professor Muhammad, you had a follow-up to some of the points Jeff was making about policing and communities of color. What is it that you wanted to say?
Sure. Well, I think we miss an opportunity here if we focus simply on the concerns of police in terms of whether or not either that their jobs are less effective because the community is not showing them as much love and consideration, or that crime is going up and therefore they need to get back in there. One of the things that Chief Brown made clear in a number of remarks is that police officers have been increasingly expected to solve a range of social problems. So they can't deal with every social calamity that exists in society, a reflection of a divestment often of these communities that police officers are sent into to help and to serve. I also want to say that the poll shows that where Black Lives Matter is concerned, 70% of African Americans polled agree with that movement, and a plurality of whites also agree with that movement. So the criticisms of Black Lives Matter, the legitimacy of a concern about systemic problems with policing, where either excessive force is used in a lethal manner or even in a non-lethal manner, is a real issue. The Department of Justice has initiated investigations nationwide in multiple municipalities. There are a number of police departments under federal consent decree, and San Francisco just reported on its own just recently that it has a problem of stopping and frisking its minority residents. So this has to remain focused on the systemic problem of policing of minority communities. Micah Johnson's hate crime and extremist behavior cannot stand in the way of the work that the Black Lives Matter movement is doing, any more than Dylan Ruth can reflect the state of race relations in America where white people are concerned.
You're nodding your head, Jean-Pierre. I'm wondering what it is that you think about that in terms of people seeking to undermine what it is that some activists are demonstrating against. There's been a lot of criticism about the Black Lives Matter movement.
Sure. I mean, I think I believe it was Jon Stewart or Trevor Noah, right, who said it best, which is that you can respect the Black Lives Matter movement and also respect this idea of Blue Lives Matter, right? Like, I'm so thankful that there are police in the street that are keeping, law and order, if you will. However, like, let's face the facts here, right? The numbers don't lie, as we talked about earlier, and it has created this level of distrust among Black people who are constantly policed, right? And so I don't know, for me it's really hard to understand the discussion. Like, I'm willing to get to the table, but for anybody who says that, what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about, which is peaceful protesting and which is basically bringing up the fact that Black lives in this country seemingly don't matter, it's a non-starter for me to have that conversation. Like, we are being policed unfairly. And so, yeah, the controversy around that, I don't understand. I respect police, but I also understand why some people now are saying here on the streets that why don't call the police, call somebody else. Let's create a local community of responders because these police are not working for us.
Anthony, I want to turn to you in the numbers because if you can, just remind us, we saw on our screen a moment ago, what are the views of different groups on the Black Lives Matter movement, but also something you noted at the top, what are the views of people regarding local police in their own community? Because it would seem that in some ways the numbers are almost contradictory in a sense. If people are feeling in their own communities local police are doing a good job, and yet there are continued concerns in some communities, help us break down exactly what these numbers show.
Look, on this issue, as in many, people recognize that these are very complicated issues and complicated dynamics. And so in this poll, people say that they trust their local police to keep them safe. And that's true of both our Black respondents and our white respondents. Okay? And they also, as Professor pointed out, there is a plurality that says that the Black Lives Matter movement has a point. Okay? So both those things can be true.
And this is among whites and blacks?
Among whites and among blacks.
Okay.
So that is not only the start of a potential dialogue, but it also shows that when you dig into public opinion a little bit, people recognize that these issues will take some time to sort out. They recognize that when there is a problem, even when they identify something as a problem, it's not working well enough, what they're not saying is that only this group or only that group is solely responsible for it. What they are saying is, okay, somehow this has to get worked out and the system isn't necessarily working as well as we'd like it to, but it doesn't all fall to just one group or another, no matter how it gets politicized. And that's a very, very different thing from public opinion.
Right. Okay. So on that political front, we know that former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani said on Sunday's Face the Nation that Black Lives Matter is, quote, inherently racist. So if we can, let's go ahead and play that for our viewers.
When you say Black Lives Matter, that's inherently racist.
Well, I think their
Black
argument
Lives Matter, white lives matter, Asian lives matter, Hispanic lives matter. That's anti-American and it's racist. Of course, black lives matter, and they matter greatly. But when you focus in on 1% of less than 1% of the murder that's going on in America, and you make it a national thing, and all of you in the media make it much bigger than the black kid who's getting killed in Chicago every 14 hours, you create a disproportion. The police understand it, and it puts a target on their back. Every cop in America will tell you that if you ask him.
All right, so Jeff Pegues, you have done research on this. You've talked to rank and file police. You've studied this issue in Chicago. Is Mayor Giuliani correct? Is some of what the Black Lives Matter movement stands for, is that something that makes officers feel as though there's a target on their back?
He is correct on that point, but the other points, he's wrong. And you know, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book and go to these neighborhoods and talk to police officers, hear both sides, and get their account of what's really happening. And based on the former mayor's comments, it doesn't sound like he's been to those neighborhoods, that he's talked to the people who live there, that he has any idea what they're really thinking and feeling and what is behind this surge of emotion over these police shootings. And then it's not really clear that he understands what I think is the reality for law enforcement right now. So I don't believe his comments reflect the reality. And that's part of the problem with this issue, is there are people who are making comments that do not reflect the reality. And you'll hear that from both sides. I've talked to police officers and police representatives who say that there are politicians who are making proposals for reform, and frankly, they have no idea what is really happening on the streets, and they're not willing to go to the streets to follow police officers to see the reality. And so you'll hear that from both sides, that there are people making comments, sort of inflaming the tensions, who frankly have not been to the neighborhoods, have not gotten an accurate picture of what's really going on the streets of this country.
Khalil, I'm wondering what you make of Mayor Giuliani's comments.
Well, he's consistent. And he's been making this comment, what I call playing the violence card. I wrote about it in the New York Times in the wake of the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman debacle.
What does that mean?
Playing the violence card means that when African Americans speak to the problem of state violence, of the legitimate monopoly on violence that the state has, as a problem, as an abridgment of their civil rights or their human rights, the response is, well, you kill each other, which is essentially to say that you have no legitimate claim on the state to treat you with dignity and respect or to uphold your constitutional rights. So think about the analogy. Domestic violence is a problem in this country, both non-lethal and lethal domestic violence. And we know for a fact that for much of the history of domestic violence in this country, policing was not on the side of the victim. That the assumption was that this was a problem to be worked out between a husband and a wife, with the presumption that the husband could manage himself. Now, those laws have changed because we've held police officers accountable for doing due diligence. So the question is, what is the state's responsibility, even in instances of interpersonal violence, to respect life? I'll give you a final example. Historically, when we saw levels of violence in white American, often urban communities for much of the early part of the 20th century, the response is not that the state nor the police have a responsibility to go in and help those communities. The response was to establish economic and social benefits that would incentivize people to feel better about themselves. This was called the Progressive Era and eventually led to the New Deal. So we have seen states and the federal government respond to premature death in white communities, even when it was done through intrapersonal violence at the domestic level and among whites, that right now is not happening. The real argument that Rudy Giuliani is making is a segregationist claim. So in the midst of Jim Crow and lynching, the argument for lynching was that, well, black people are a threat to society. We can't protect their rights until they behave themselves properly. It's the same argument. Until black people behave themselves properly, they're not entitled to the same constitutional protections and the quality of state response to their suffering as everybody else.
All right. Coming up, Alicia Keys going live with a powerful PSA. Beyonce, Chris Rock, and Rihanna are just a few artists featured. They're making a statement and advocating for justice. We'll show you that video next. This is CBSN. Alicia Keys went live Wednesday with a powerful PSA calling for radical transformation in racial justice. Keys collaborated her We Are Here movement along with other artists, including Beyonce, Rihanna, and Pharrell Williams, for the site Mic.com. Take a listen.
Failing to signal a lane change. Riding in your girlfriend's car with a child in the back.
Run into the bathroom in your own apartment.
Selling cigarettes outside of a corner store.
Riding a commuter train.
Walking home with a friend.
Making eye contact.
Selling CDs outside of a supermarket.
Wearing a hoodie.
Walking away from police.
Walking toward police.
I want to get final thoughts from our panel, starting with our Jeff Pegues in Cleveland. Jeff?
Well, I think Dallas, for this country, the question is, will that be a turning point, or will the rift grow? And I think that is the challenge for the leaders in this country on both sides of the aisle, and for law enforcement and members of the black community. So will Dallas be a turning point? I think that's a big question going forward.
Anthony?
Look, tragedies like this often put issues on the table in the discussion that are always there. We just don't always talk about them, especially in light of a big national election. What I can tell you is that in the polling, there's a recent Pew study where people, both Republicans and Democrats, say that this issue matters a lot in their vote. In our own polling, especially for Democrats, but also for Republicans, people say that rights and securing rights for people who deserve them and settling some of these issues is extremely important to them. So there is an opportunity for dialogue here. It clearly is an issue that will matter. Whether or not it is politicized is an open question, but it has definitely raised important questions going forward.
Khalil?
Well, I just want to say we're in the midst of a 2016 presidential election, and we have a candidate now who's evoking law and order as the mantra of the party, the Republican Party. We've been down that road. It gave us the biggest prison system the world has ever known. We have reached the point of diminishing returns where criminal justice becomes the blunt instrument of controlling communities that have long been the subject of divestment. So I'm hoping that this political season will see a reversal of that conversation so we can actually move forward.
Jean-Pierre?
You know, between my friends and I, black and white and Hispanic and Asian, you know, we keep coming back to this one quote, and it's a James Baldwin quote, and he says, you know, I know that things take time, but how much time do you need for your progress? And it's whether it has to do with policing or it has to do with equality in America. I just hope that change comes faster than social media makes it seem it's coming. Because if that's not the case, I really fear, you know, a larger tear between the races in this country. And I just, as a black and white individual, I don't want to get to that place.
All right, my thanks to Anthony Salvanto, Khalil Mohammed, Jean-Pierre Regis, and Jeff Pegues.